The storm arrived without warning, the way the worst things in life always do. 1 hour before midnight, the temperature in Aspen had dropped to -14 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind was pushing snow sideways across the mountain roads, with the kind of force that made streetlights swing like pendulums and stripped the branches from the old pines lining the highway into town. By the time most residents had pulled their curtains shut and turned their heaters up, the blizzard had buried the sidewalks under 2 feet of white silence. Schools would cancel in the morning. The ski resort would shut its upper lifts. Sensible people would not go outside unless they absolutely had to. And yet, on a stretch of road that connected the eastern edge of the Harrington Grand Resort property to the older neighborhood of modest cabins half a mile past the tree line, one man was walking. His name was Daniel Mercer. He was 38 years old, though in certain kinds of light, especially the gray, exhausted light of a Colorado winter evening, he could have passed for older. He wore a dark wool coat that had seen better years, a knit cap pulled low over his forehead, and work boots that were good but not waterproof, a distinction that had been punishing him for the past 40 minutes, as the snow crept over their tops with every step. He walked with the even, unhurried stride of someone who had done this particular route so many times that his body had memorized it, who no longer measured the distance in terms of effort, but simply let the familiar landscape pass around him like a slowly changing painting. The resort's service entrance gate, the junction at Old Mill Road, the stone wall that separated the Harrington estate from the public land, the gas station with the broken neon sign, then the long straightaway bordered by lodgepole pines, and finally, just past a gentle bend, the small cluster of rental cabins where he had been living for the past 2 years. The walk was nearly 2 miles. He made it every night, 5 nights a week, and twice on Saturdays, when the resort needed someone to inspect the snow removal equipment at dawn. He did not make this walk because he enjoyed it, though there were nights in autumn when the air smelled of pine resin and the sky above Aspen held more stars than the eye could process, and on those nights something in him did settle into a quiet peace. He made this walk because the truck he had been driving since his divorce had finally seized its engine 18 months ago, and he had not yet saved enough to replace it, and he was constitutionally incapable of asking anyone for a lift. Not out of stubbornness, exactly. More out of a principle he had arrived at through hard experience, which was this: a man who relies on other people's goodwill to get through his daily life will eventually find that goodwill has conditions attached, and those conditions always cost more than whatever convenience they offered. Daniel Mercer had once owned a company. That sentence, deployed in casual conversation, tended to produce a particular kind of disbelieving pause. The same pause people make when a man in a maintenance uniform mentions that he used to play professional ball, or that he speaks 3 languages, or that he once held a patent. The past tense is the thing that unsettles people. It implies loss, and loss implies failure. And most people would rather not sit next to failure on the bus. The truth was more complicated than failure, though it looked the same from the outside. He had built a precision engineering firm in Denver over a period of 9 years, starting from a single contract with a medical device manufacturer and growing it into a team of 22 people who designed and fabricated components for aerospace applications. He had been good at it, better than good. He had 2 patents registered to his name, both relating to thermal stress management in lightweight alloy structures, and the larger of the 2 had generated licensing income for 3 consecutive years. He had been married. He had been, by most conventional measures, building something worth calling a life. Then his business partner, his college roommate, the best man at his wedding, the person he had trusted with every financial decision the firm had ever made, had spent 14 months quietly redirecting client payments into a separate account, had refinanced the company's assets against loans that Daniel had never signed, and had vanished one Thursday morning in March with enough money to disappear comfortably somewhere that did not have an extradition treaty. The company folded within 60 days. The marriage followed within 6 months, not because his wife was cruel, but because she had married a man who had a plan, and the plan was gone, and she was honest enough to admit that she didn't know how to love the version of him that had no plan at all. He did not blame her. He understood it in the same detached way that he understood most painful things as a fact of physics, rather than a moral failing. Objects in motion tend to stay in motion. Structures under sufficient stress will fracture along their weakest seam. He had been a weak seam in her life. She had moved on, He had not moved on, exactly. He had moved sideways. He had taken the maintenance job at the Harrington Grand because the pay was steady and the work was honest, and nobody at a ski resort asked a mechanic about his career trajectory. He fixed things: snowmakers, lift motors, heating systems in the guest chalets. He was methodical and quiet, and he never left a job half-finished, which made him more valuable than the resort's management fully appreciated, though they appreciated it enough to keep scheduling him. He lived in the small cabin. He walked the 2 miles. He saved what he could. He did not talk about what he had lost, and he did not spend time thinking about what he might rebuild, because rebuilding required a faith in the future that he was still working up to. For now, there was just the snow, and the road, and the cold air filling his lungs, and the slow accumulation of days that didn't get any worse. That was the man walking east on Old Mill Road at 11:47 on a Thursday night in January, when the blizzard reached its peak intensity and the world contracted to a tunnel of white, and somewhere off to his left, half hidden behind the stone wall of the Harrington estate, something began to bark. The sound was high and sharp and distressed, in a way that cut through the noise of the wind. Daniel stopped. He turned his head, locating the direction. He had spent enough time working around the resort's grounds to recognize the sound of an animal in trouble, as distinct from the sound of an animal simply reacting to weather or a passing car. This was the former. He walked toward the wall, his boots punching through the hardened crust of old snow, and when he reached the wrought iron fence that ran along the base of the wall, he saw it immediately: a dog, white as the snow surrounding it, a large Samoyed with an improbably full coat, its right forepaw caught in the gap between 2 fence rails, where the metal had bent outward at an angle, probably from a tree branch falling in a previous storm. The dog was pulling hard, which was making the situation worse, the way panic always makes things worse, its breath coming in fast visible puffs, and its dark eyes wide with a fear that had gone past distress into something approaching despair. Daniel crouched down. He spoke quietly, the way he had learned to speak around equipment that was sensitive to vibration, low and even and without urgency, as if everything was already fine and they were just working out the details. The dog looked at him. Its ears moved. It stopped pulling. He worked his gloved hands around the caught paw, and carefully, incrementally, shifted the angle of the metal rail, using his body weight as leverage. And after about 90 seconds, the paw came free. The dog sat down immediately in the snow and began licking the spot where the rail had pressed. And Daniel checked it with careful fingers and found no break, just bruising and the cold. He looked at the tag on the collar. It was not a tag exactly. It was a small plate of what appeared to be white gold, engraved with a name in elegant script: Sam. Below the name, a phone number, and below that, a line that made him blink and read it again. Reward offered, $100,000. He sat back on his heels in the snow and looked at the dog and looked at the tag and felt something that was not quite temptation, but was in the same family: an awareness of possibility, the sharp consciousness of a number that could change things. $100,000 was a new truck and a new start, and 2 years of breathing room. $100,000 was the distance between where he was and somewhere better. He was aware of all of this with great clarity. He was also aware, in exactly the same moment, that the dog was not his, had never been his, belonged to someone who was almost certainly in anguish right now, and that the only thing he had ever genuinely kept through the collapse of his company and his marriage and everything else was the habit of not taking what wasn't his. He picked up the dog. It was heavier than it looked. He tucked it against his chest, the way he'd once seen a man carry an injured ewe, and he turned back toward the road and kept walking east. His phone was dead. He had forgotten to charge it the night before, a fact he discovered when he pulled it from his pocket, and the screen stayed black, regardless of how long he held the side button. He stopped at the only building still lit on that stretch of road, a convenience store run by a man named Pete, who kept the lights on until 1 in the morning because he had insomnia and the store gave him somewhere to be. Pete was behind the counter with a cup of instant coffee and a crossword puzzle. And he looked up when Daniel came in carrying a snow-covered Samoyed and said, in the tone of someone who has been surprised by enough things to have stopped being surprised by anything, "That's a nice dog." Daniel asked to use the phone. Pete let him, and he called the number on the collar. But it went to a voicemail recording of a woman's voice. Low and controlled, and clearly fighting to stay that way, asking anyone with information about Sam to please call back immediately, and leaving a second number for what she described as her head of security. Daniel left a message on both. He described where he'd found the dog, gave Pete's store address, said he was continuing home but would leave Sam with Pete if someone could come, and then Pete said the dog looked cold, and maybe the man should just take it home and wait for a callback in the morning, which was sensible advice. 3 other customers came in over the next 20 minutes, all of them wanting Pete to ring up cigarettes or energy drinks, and all of them taking one look at the collar and saying variations of the same thing. Take the money, keep the dog. Who would even know? One of them was more pointed about it. You know what that reward could do for a guy like you? He said, not unkindly, squinting at Daniel's coat with its worn elbows and its missing third button. Daniel looked at him for a moment without answering, and the man seemed to hear something in the silence. And he took his energy drink and left. Not what I found it for, Daniel said to Pete, who hadn't asked. He picked up Sam and walked out into the storm. Sophia Harrington had built her first company at 24, sold it at 27, and spent the following decade building the company that would eventually make her name synonymous with applied artificial intelligence in the logistics sector. She was 38 years old, the same age as the man currently walking through her blizzard with her dog tucked under his arm. Though in almost every other measurable way their lives existed in different universes. She had an apartment in San Francisco, a house in Aspen that had been her father's, a staff of 1,140 people distributed across 4 continents, and a net worth that financial journalists described with the word billion in the way other people describe the weather matter-of-factly, without particular emphasis. She had a security team. She had a helicopter on retainer. She had, by any rational metric, everything necessary to locate one missing dog in one snowstorm in one small Colorado mountain town. None of it had worked. Sam had gotten out through a gate that a contractor had left unlatched while doing work on the estate's perimeter wall, a detail that Sophia had learned at approximately 7:15 in the evening when her housekeeper called to say she couldn't find the dog and that the gate near the old service path was standing open. By 7:30 she had called Marcus, her head of security, and by 8 o'clock there were 2 SUVs combing the roads and one of her company's mapping drones working the area in a grid pattern above the tree line. The storm grounded the drone by 8:45. The roads were becoming impassable for anything that wasn't a 4-wheel drive, and her security team was experienced at human threats but considerably less so at snow rescue for animals. She had called the police at 9, who were sympathetic but honest about their capacity in a blizzard. She had called the Aspen Mountain Rescue at 9:15, who were handling 3 weather-related incidents involving humans and couldn't prioritize a dog. She had called every neighbor within a mile radius of the property whose number she had. She had stood outside in the storm for 40 minutes herself, calling Sam's name into the wind until her voice went raw, and she had come back inside and sat down at the kitchen table and felt, for the first time in years, genuinely helpless. The feeling was not unfamiliar exactly. She had felt it once before, in a hospital waiting room, in this same house, watching her father breathe through a ventilator, while the doctors spoke to her in the careful language they use when they are preparing you for the end. Her father had died in March, 3 years ago, and she had flown back to Aspen from a board meeting in Singapore and had not left the house for 2 weeks afterward. Sam had been there for all of it. Her father had gotten the dog 5 years before he died, a puppy from a breeder in Montana, named for a research station in Antarctica where her father had done field work as a young man, and the dog had spent every winter at the Aspen house being walked by her father along the mountain trails and sleeping at the foot of his bed and, in the last year of his life, refusing to leave his side even for meals. After his death, Sam had transferred this loyalty entirely to Sophia, with the uncomplicated completeness that only dogs are capable of, and she had found in that loyalty something that the grief counselors and the grief itself had not been able to give her: a daily reminder that attachment is not foolish, that it is the most animal and essential thing there is, and that it survives the death of the person who taught you how to practice it. Which was why, when her phone rang at 11:58 and a quiet male voice explained that he had found her dog near the fence line on Old Mill Road, and that Sam appeared to be unhurt, and that he was continuing to carry the dog home because Pete's convenience store was closing, she started crying, Before she had even registered the full content of the message, she called Marcus. She pulled her coat on. She went out to the Rolls-Royce Phantom that sat under its own heated garage cover and drove it herself, which she never did in a blizzard, through streets that were empty and white and strange, following the GPS coordinates that the man had texted from Pete's store phone before he left. She found him 3/4 of a mile east of the junction at Old Mill Road, a dark shape moving steadily through the white. Hunched slightly forward against the wind, something pale and large held against his chest. She pulled alongside him and lowered the passenger window, and the cold came in immediately, filling the warm interior of the car with the smell of snow and pine. She called out. He stopped and turned. In the headlights, she could see his face square-jawed, unshaven, the skin around his eyes creased in the particular way of someone who works outdoors, and she could see Sam's head resting against his collarbone, the dog's eyes half closed with exhaustion and warmth, the white coat flattened against his dark jacket where the snow had compacted it. She pushed the door open. "Please," she said. The word came out without the usual surface composure she maintained in professional settings. Just the word, and everything underneath it. "Let me drive you home." He looked at her. He looked at the car, at the warm interior, visible through the open door, at the leather seats and the soft console lighting. Then he looked back at the road ahead of him, and something passed across his face that she couldn't fully read, not calculation, not stubbornness, more like a man checking in with a principle so deeply held that it had become reflexive, automatic, the way an athlete checks their form. He handed her Sam through the window. His hands, she noticed, were bare. He had given his gloves away, apparently to wrap around the dog's paws. She saw that his knuckles were cracked from the cold, the skin around his wrists red and raw. "No," he said. And then quietly, as if he were aware that a flat refusal to a woman who had just spent 4 hours searching for her dog in a blizzard required some small acknowledgement. "Thank you." He resumed walking. She sat in the idling Rolls-Royce with her dog in her lap and watched him go. And the feeling she experienced in that moment was one she had no ready category for. In the world Sophia Harrington occupied, people did not refuse things. They accepted cars and invitations and checks and opportunities and access, because those were the currencies of the world she moved in, and everyone understood that the offer of them was also, always, a minor assertion of power. She was not a cruel or calculating person, but she understood that dynamic clearly, and she lived inside it, without much friction. She had never, in recent memory, extended an offer and had it simply, gently, without drama or resentment, declined. He walked away from her in the snow the way a man walks home from work with purpose, but without hurry. As if the distance were simply a fact of the evening and not a hardship, and the cold were simply the weather, and none of it reflected particularly on him one way or another. She watched until the darkness took him. Then she drove home with Sam, and she sat by the fire for a long time, not reading the book she had opened, thinking about a man who gave away his gloves and declined a warm car and said thank you and meant it and walked away. She found him the next morning at the resort. It took Marcus approximately 40 minutes to identify the man. Daniel Mercer, 38, senior maintenance technician at the Harrington Grand since 2 years prior, residing in cabin 7 of the staff housing complex on the East Perimeter, no moving violations, no criminal record, credit score in the poor range due to outstanding business debts from a company dissolution in Denver 5 years prior. Marcus presented her with this information over breakfast, in the manner of a man who has been trained to present intelligence without editorializing, but she could see from his expression that he had editorializing he was holding back, which was unusual enough that she asked him to say it. His business partner stole from him, Marcus said, cleaned out the accounts, and disappeared. The partner was never found. Mercer declined to pursue civil litigation. This last sentence seemed to cost Marcus something to report, as if declining to pursue civil litigation for financial fraud were a category of behavior his security training had not fully prepared him to evaluate. She took her checkbook. She drove to the resort herself, which surprised the front desk staff sufficiently that 3 of them followed her at a discreet distance down the service corridor to the maintenance bay, where Daniel Mercer was crouched over the exposed undercarriage of a snowcat, doing something to its hydraulic linkage with the focused attention of a man who is thinking about only one thing at a time. He heard her come in the maintenance bay, had excellent acoustics, and he stood up and turned around, and when he saw her he nodded once, the way a man nods to an acquaintance he's not surprised to see, and said, "Good morning." She told him what she had come to say. She put the check on the workbench beside him, the figure facing up. And she said the reward was his, and he had earned it. And she wanted him to take it. He looked at the check. He looked at it for a while, the way a person looks at something they are considering seriously rather than dismissing. Then he picked it up and held it out to her. "I can't take this," he said. "The reward was genuine," she said. "It's not charity." "I know it's not charity," he said. "That's not why I can't take it." She asked him, then, what he wanted. She asked it plainly. The way she asked questions in negotiations, when she had decided to stop performing patience and simply get to the point, and the question landed the same way it always did in those contexts, with a small silence that cleared the air of everything unnecessary. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite shyness, but something between them, the expression of a man who finds a situation gently absurd but does not want to be rude about it. "A cup of coffee would be nice," he said. She laughed. She had not laughed like that with actual, unguarded surprise in longer than she could precisely remember. The sound of it seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised him, and they stood in the maintenance bay, looking at each other with the slightly confused expressions of two people who have accidentally stumbled into an honest moment. And then they went and got coffee from the staff cafeteria, which was not what either of them had expected from the morning, and they talked for an hour and a half, and by the end of it Sophia had not made any decisions yet, but she understood that she was going to. She went back to San Francisco that weekend, but she took Sam with her. And she found herself, over the following 2 weeks, returning in idle moments to details from that conversation in the cafeteria, his habit of listening without performing interest, the way he answered questions about his past, with a directness that was neither defensive nor performatively humble, the precise and concrete way he described problems, and the equally precise way he described how he had solved them, without emphasis or narrative embellishment, the way engineers describe things, when they are talking about work, they actually understand. She had been in rooms with a great many engineers. She could tell the difference between someone who understood the principles and someone who had internalized them until they became a way of thinking, a way of seeing every mechanical and structural problem as a conversation between forces that wanted to be balanced. He was the second kind. She had Marcus check his patents. Both were real, both were credible, and one of them, the thermal stress management application, described a principle that her own engineering team had been circling around for the past 8 months in the context of a hardware component they were developing for their newest logistics AI platform. She called her chief technology officer and read him the abstract. There was a silence. "Who filed this?" he asked. She told him. Another silence. "Is he available?" he asked. She said she thought she could find out. She called Daniel on a Tuesday evening from her office in San Francisco, and she offered him a consulting role. She was direct about it, which she suspected was the only approach that would work. She told him she had reviewed his patents. She told him specifically what problem she needed solved, and she told him the compensation she was prepared to offer. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't want to be hired as a favor." She said she understood that, and she said the favor had been having coffee with him, and this was work. He said he would think about it. She said fine. He called back the next morning. He started the following Monday, which gave her the weekend to arrange a temporary workspace at the Aspen office, and to alert her team in the way that she had learned, through experience, was most effective simply by sending an email that said Daniel Mercer would be joining the hardware integration team in an advisory capacity beginning Monday, and that she expected him to be treated accordingly. The email did not elaborate, because elaboration would have implied that elaboration was necessary, and she had found that the way you frame an introduction tends to determine how it lands. What she could not entirely control, she knew, were the private conversations that would happen before Monday, and some of those would inevitably include the information that Daniel Mercer had until recently been fixing snowcats and replacing light bulbs in the guest chalets. She was not naive about that. She just didn't consider it her problem to solve. He arrived on Monday in the same boots and a different jacket, and he shook hands with everyone he was introduced to and forgot nobody's name, which was a habit she noticed and filed away. He was given a desk near the engineering team and access to the project files. And he spent the first day reading. Just reading. Not asking questions, not proposing solutions, not performing the kind of enthusiastic engagement that new contractors often produced in the first week, like a job interview that had been accidentally extended. He read, and he took notes in a small paper notebook that he carried in his jacket pocket. And by the end of the day, the lead engineer, a methodical and skeptical man from MIT named Thomas Chen, had started gravitating toward his desk with the specific quality of attention that very competent people give to other people they suspect might be as competent as they are. By Wednesday, Daniel had identified the source of the thermal cycling problem that had been causing microfractures in the housing unit of the sensor array. A materials interaction that the team's simulation model had been underweighting because of an incorrect assumption in the initial parameters, an assumption that was documented in a paper published 15 years ago and that everyone in the field had been treating as settled. It was not, he explained, with the quiet precision of a man stating facts rather than winning arguments, settled. He showed Thomas the calculation. Thomas was silent for a long time. Then he called two other engineers over. The four of them stood around Daniel's notebook for 45 minutes. At the end of it, Thomas looked up and said, without any of the skepticism he had been carrying all week, "How long have you known this?" Daniel said he had been thinking about a version of the problem for the better part of 5 years, since before his patent. But he hadn't had the resources to test the hypothesis properly. Thomas nodded slowly, in the way people nod when they are processing something that requires a revision of a previous assumption. The rest of the team's attitude shifted in the way that attitudes shift when competence makes itself undeniable, not dramatically, not with apology, but with the quiet, gravitational reorientation of people who understand that their interests are better served by incorporating a new capability than by defending against it. Within 2 weeks, he was being included in the planning meetings. Within a month, the project was using his revised parameter model, and the simulation results were coming back clean for the first time since the project had started. Thomas, who was not given to professional sentimentality, wrote in his progress report that the advisory contribution from Daniel Mercer had likely saved the project 6 months of iteration time and a redesign cycle that would have cost the company somewhere between $800,000 and $1.2 million. Sophia read this in her morning briefing and did not say anything to anyone about it because she was trying to manage a feeling that she recognized from her professional life but had rarely felt about a person. It was, she thought, something like respect. Not the performed respect of an executive acknowledging a subordinate's contribution, but the actual kind. The kind that changes how you look at someone when they walk into a room, the kind that makes you listen more carefully to what they say, because you have stopped assuming you already know what they mean. She had felt it for her father, and for 2 or 3 mentors in her early career, and for a handful of people she had worked alongside long enough to see them under pressure. She was feeling it now, and it was complicated by something else that she was moving more carefully around, because she had learned the hard way that the professional and the personal do not mix without cost, and she was not ready to calculate that cost yet. She watched him, in the way that people watch when they think they are being unobtrusive and are not quite succeeding. She watched the way he stopped to learn the cafeteria manager's grandmother's name after hearing her mention it once in passing, and followed up 2 weeks later to ask how she was doing, and the cafeteria manager's expression when he asked was the expression of someone who had not expected to be remembered. She watched the way he fixed a jammed door in the copy room one morning without telling anyone he had done it, just crouched down with a tool he happened to have in his pocket and worked at it until it moved freely again. She watched the way he sat with the junior engineers at lunch instead of the senior staff, not as a social strategy, but because the junior engineers asked him questions about the work, and he preferred talking about the work to talking about everything else. She had known a great many talented people, and most of them were in some way in conversation with their own talent, aware of it, managing it, deploying it. Daniel Mercer seemed genuinely uninterested in the subject of Daniel Mercer. He was interested in the problem in front of him, and the people around him, and what he could do with whatever was in his hands at the moment. And everything else was apparently beside the point. One evening in late February, she stayed late at the Aspen office. She had been shuttling between San Francisco and Aspen since he started. More than she needed to professionally, a fact she was aware of and had been declining to examine, and she found him in the break room, making tea with the mechanical focused attention he gave to everything, as if the kettle and the bag and the timing of the steep were a small project worth doing correctly. She sat across from him, and they talked for a while about the project, and then about a problem he had noticed in a different part of the hardware design that nobody had asked him to look at, and then the conversation drifted the way conversations drift when two people are tired, and the professional context has softened around the edges, and she asked him something she had been holding for weeks. "Why didn't you get in the car?" she asked. That night, he was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone finding a diplomatic answer, but the quiet of someone checking whether the honest answer is the right one to give, and then deciding it is. "If I had gotten in that car," he said, "because it was warm, or because it was a Rolls-Royce, or because you were grateful enough that I thought I might get something out of it, then, every time I thought about returning Sam, I would wonder if that's why I did it. If I was calculating something." He looked at his tea. "I've had things taken from me by people who were calculating. I'm not that person. I don't want to become that person. So I walked." She looked at him across the break room table, in the fluorescent light that was flattering to no one, and she felt something break open in her chest, in the quiet way that important things break not with drama, but with the slow inevitability of a dam that has been holding against more pressure than it was built for. She thought about her father, who had told her when she was 22, and just starting out, and already making the calculating decisions that would characterize her professional success. There are two kinds of people in the world: Sophia, the ones who are always trading, and the ones who have something they won't trade. Find the second kind, and hold on to them. She had thought she understood what he meant. She was beginning to understand more precisely. She didn't say any of this. She said, "That's a very expensive principle to walk home on," and he smiled. And she smiled. And they finished their tea in the comfortable quiet of two people who have said enough for one night. Spring came slowly to Aspen, the snow retreating from the lower slopes in March, and the valley roads clearing in April, while the high country stayed white until June. In that time, the hardware project moved from prototype to refinement, to something that could credibly be described as production-ready, and the role that Daniel Mercer occupied within it shifted from advisory to central, in the way that things shift when a person's presence has become structural rather than supplementary. He was not given a title. Sophia had not yet asked him what he wanted, beyond coffee and the satisfaction of a problem solved. She was aware of this omission, and it was deliberate, because she was trying to do something she was not naturally patient enough to do. She was trying to let something develop at its own pace without engineering the outcome. They had dinner twice, both times in the casual way that colleagues have dinner when they are working late, and someone suggests food, and neither person admits that this particular suggestion carries any particular weight. They talked about his work, and about the company's direction, and about a paper he had been reading on composite materials, and about her father, and about his ex-wife, in the careful way people talk about ex-spouses when the wound is healed but the scar is still visible, and about the engineering program he had attended at Colorado State on a merit scholarship from a town that had never before sent anyone to Colorado State on a scholarship of any kind. She told him about the months after her father's death. He listened with the quality of attention that made you feel the thing you were saying was worth saying, which is the rarest quality in a listener, and the most valuable, and she found that she was saying things she had not said to other people, not because they wouldn't have understood, but because she hadn't trusted them with the understanding. She was not in the habit of needing things from people. She had constructed her life with some care around the premise that need was a vulnerability, and vulnerability was a liability. And the life she had constructed was by most measures successful, but she was beginning to suspect, watching Daniel walk across the parking lot with his paper notebook in his jacket pocket, and his particular unhurried stride, that what she had built was a very well-engineered structure, with no one inside it. Her father had known this. Sam knew it in the way dogs know things, which is directly and without analysis. She was the last one to figure it out, which was perhaps appropriate. In May, the product was ready. The core innovation, the revised thermal stress model, the materials solution, the sensor housing design that had resulted from 3 months of iteration, was ready to be built at scale, and the implications for the logistics AI platform were substantial enough that Sophia had been fielding calls from the board about the launch timeline since April. She had been vague about the timeline on purpose, because she had something she wanted to do before the launch that the board did not need to know about in advance. She called Daniel into her office on a Thursday afternoon, sat him down across from her desk, and offered him the position of co-chief executive officer of Harrington Technologies. She did not frame it as a gift. She told him what she needed. Someone who understood the engineering at a level that allowed real strategic decisions rather than translated ones. Someone who could speak to both the technical and the human dimensions of a company that was building systems that would affect the way millions of people's work was organized. Someone she trusted. She told him the last part last, and she told it plainly, which was harder than the rest of it. He sat with it for a moment. She watched his face and saw the same movement she had seen in the maintenance bay, the checking in with the principal, the inventory of what this was and what it wasn't. Then he said, "You're sure this isn't because of Sam? Sam brought me to Old Mill Road in a blizzard," she said. "He didn't teach you how to solve a thermal cycling problem." He was quiet for another moment. "I want to be useful," he said. "Not ornamental. I'm not interested in ornamental," she said. He said he would need a week to think about it. She said she would give him 2. He took 1. The product launch was held in June, in the resort ballroom, a practical choice, since most of the engineering team had been based in Aspen for the development phase, and there was something Sophia found fitting about holding the event in the building where Daniel had spent 2 winters fixing broken things in the quiet before dawn. The room held 300 people. Engineers, investors, board members, journalists, the mayor of Aspen, and a contingent of industry analysts who had been tracking the company's hardware division with growing interest. Daniel stood beside her at the podium, which she had not told him he would be doing until the morning of the event, giving him just enough time to be uncomfortable about it, without having enough time to fully resist. She introduced him. She told the room the story, not the version of it that began with the patent or the consulting contract, but the version that began on Old Mill Road in January, in a blizzard, with a dog caught in a fence. She told it the way it happened, without elaboration or sentiment, and it landed with the specific weight that true stories land with when they are told plainly. She said, "A man walked 2 miles through a snowstorm to give back something that wasn't his. He turned down a ride home. He turned down a check. He asked for a cup of coffee, and then he solved a problem that my engineering team had been working on for 8 months. He is the most honest person I have encountered in 20 years of working in this industry. And he is the reason we are here tonight. And if any of you want to argue with his title on the organizational chart, his name is Daniel Mercer. And he will explain it to you in terms you will find very difficult to dispute." The room laughed. Then it stood up, and the applause was the kind that comes from 300 people simultaneously experiencing the relief of a story that ended the way it should have. Afterward, when the room had thinned to a few dozen people finishing their drinks and talking in small groups, she found him near the windows that looked out over the mountain, his jacket off, his paper notebook in his breast pocket, talking to one of the junior engineers about something that was making both of them laugh. Sam was there. She had brought Sam, because it was Sam's story too, and the dog was lying under the table at Daniel's feet, with the settled contentment of an animal that knows exactly where it belongs. She watched them for a moment from across the room. The dog and the engineer's laugh, which she had learned was infrequent enough to mean something when it happened, and she thought about her father saying find the second kind and hold on to them, and she thought she had, and she thought it had taken a blizzard and a fence and a 2-mile walk and a cup of coffee and 5 months of careful, slow, unmistakable accumulation to get here, but she was here, and so was he, and that felt like enough. She crossed the room. She touched his arm, and he turned, and she said she needed to show him something outside. He looked at her with the steady attention he gave to things that mattered, and he said okay, and he gave his excuses to the engineer, and they went out together through the side door, with Sam following at their heels, into the June night that was cold still but not bitterly so, the kind of cold that is more reminder than punishment. She had arranged for the car to be waiting on the east side of the building, not the Rolls-Royce that had been her father's car, and it lived in the Aspen garage as a kind of permanent monument to a man who had believed that good things should be well made. The car waiting was a different car. The one she drove herself on roads she knew, a dark blue Range Rover that was warm inside and had a travel blanket on the back seat for Sam. She walked Daniel to the edge of the parking lot, where the light from the building gave way to the darkness of the mountain road, the road that ran east toward the old service gate and the bend where the staff cabins sat, the road she now knew he had walked so many times in the dark and in the snow, and in the thin early morning before the rest of the town was awake. She opened the passenger door. She looked at him in the pale light from the car's interior. This man she had come to know slowly and honestly and without strategy, this man who had given his gloves to her dog and walked home in the cold and declined 200,000 reasons to be something he didn't want to be. And she said, smiling in a way that she didn't bother to make professional or composed, "Are you going to walk?" He looked at the car. He looked at her. He looked at the road, the dark mountain road running east through the summer night, toward whatever came next, and something in his face settled into a stillness that was not the stillness of resignation or calculation, but the stillness of a man who has arrived somewhere he had not known he was heading toward, and finds, against all expectation, that it is exactly right. He reached down and scratched Sam's ear. Then he looked back at her and smiled the small, real, unhurried smile she had learned to wait for, and he got in. Sam jumped in behind him without being asked, because Sam understood geometry even when humans were still working it out. Sophia closed the door and walked around to the driver's side and got in. And she started the engine, and the headlights came on and lit up the road ahead. And they drove east together through the aspen night, past the stone wall and the old service gate, and the junction at Old Mill Road, and the stretch of highway where the pines stood dark and straight on either side, and the snow that had covered everything in January was gone now, replaced by the slow green beginning of another season. She did not ask where they were going. He did not offer a direction. They drove, and the road was clear ahead of them, and that was enough. The road and the night and the dog breathing quietly in the back seat, and the fact that they were, at last, going the same way. What happened in the months and years that followed was not simple, because nothing real is simple, and both of them were old enough to know that the things worth having are the things that require you to keep choosing them not once in a dramatic moment, but every ordinary day in ways that are small and undramatic, and entirely consistent with who you are. He moved out of cabin 7 and into the main house, not because she asked him to, but because after a certain point, the commute became an argument neither of them was interested in making. He took the co-CEO role seriously, which meant he was often difficult, and always direct and occasionally infuriating in the specific way that very principled people are infuriating when they refuse to make the expedient choice. The board learned to respect him. He did not appear to notice how long it took them. She learned what it felt like to have someone in her life who was not there because of what she offered, but because of who she was, and the feeling was sustaining in a way that success alone had never managed the way a thing sustains you, when it is true rather than merely pleasant. He learned what it felt like to build something again without terror, because this time he had chosen better. And this time the thing he was building was not a company or a career but a life, which is the only structure that matters in the end. On the first anniversary of the night he had found Sam in the fence. He stopped at the place in the fence that had been repaired the following spring, now invisible under new growth, and he stood in the January cold, thinking about what a chain of events looks like from the end of it. How the individual links are so small, and how the first one had been nothing more than a dog's bark in the wind, and the decision to turn toward it instead of away. Sometimes the quiet integrity of an ordinary choice to return what isn't yours, to walk when you could ride, to ask only for what you actually need casts a longer shadow than you expect. Not always, not reliably, but sometimes, in the particular convergence of one man's character and one woman's clarity and one dog's persistent need to find where he belongs, the shadow falls exactly right, and you end up on a mountain road in January wondering how you arrived somewhere so much better than you thought you were headed. With the only honest answer being this: one step at a time, through the snow, in the dark, going home.